If you put 2.5 bars of pressure at your turbo at sea level, it's fine. But you put 2.5 bars at Pikes Peak and your turbo has to spin an extra 100,000 RPM to create that pressure. That's where we added turbo speed sensors on all the turbos.
Welcome to the HPA Tuned In podcast. I'm Andre, your host, and in this episode, we've got Grégoire joining us from Boxeer in the USA. Greg is originally from France, but has been based in the US for the last 10 years, running his business Boxeer. It's got an interesting background in that Boxeer actually was developed around providing a V-dub turbo diesel upgrade in power for the Volkswagen Vanagon, sort of a overlanding vehicle. So probably not something that a lot of listeners to this podcast would necessarily be familiar with. However, more relevant to our interest is Greg's exploits at Pikes Peak, basically running at the very front of the diesel field. In fact, only narrowly missing out on the diesel record up Pikes Peak, which is something he is seeking to put right in the 2022 running of the Pikes Peak hill climb, also coincidentally the 100th running of that hill climb. Now, traditionally, when we think of diesel performance, we're probably not really thinking of top-tier race cars, maybe outside of diesel's use in the likes of sled pulling competition and that sort of thing. However, the diesel performance engine industry is massive, and it is possible to get some exceptional gains in power out of these engines. There's obviously the potential to upgrade the engine internals to cope with additional power, just like we would normally be used to with a gasoline-based engine. However, in Greg's application, he's actually found a specific V-dub model of engine, and he is working very hard to make more power, significantly more power, while staying within the realms of what the factory internal components are capable of handling. He's also utilizing some reasonably advanced technology to help him in this aim, such as in-cylinder combustion pressure monitoring. Now, before we get into our interview with Greg, if you haven't heard of High Performance Academy before, we are an online training school. We specialize in teaching people how to tune EFI systems, both factory and aftermarket, on both gasoline and diesel engines. We also cover performance engine building your own wiring harness, as well as race driver education, race car setup, and how to use data analysis to improve your own performance. Obviously, with a diesel-focused podcast today, relevant to our podcast episode, we've got our diesel fundamentals course, our diesel tuning fundamentals course, and also our practical diesel tuning course, which will teach you everything you need to know when it comes to extracting more performance with a tune out of your diesel engine. And particularly, this is an area I know a lot of existing tuners struggle with, particularly if you have come from the gasoline tuning world. Everything we really know about improving performance when it comes to the tune in a gasoline engine kind of really goes out the window with diesel engines. They operate on a very different process, the compression, ignition, combustion process, and everything we need to understand is very specific to that process. I'll put a link in the show notes to both of those courses, and as a podcast listener, you can also use the coupon code podcast75. That'll get you $75 off the purchase of your very first HPA course. All right, enough of an introduction though. Let's get into our chat with Greg now. All right, welcome to the podcast, Greg. Thanks for joining us today. Now, when most people think of diesel engines, they're probably getting an image of a big old heavy truck chugging away up a hill, belching out plumes of black smoke, which is about as far away from performance as you could probably get. Now, yes, of course, there is a fairly wide market for performance diesel engines, which we're going to jump into. But when you're looking at your options of modifying gasoline engines or diesel engines, what was it that made you jump down the diesel route?
I started with diesel because I was using this on my business. So it was an engine of choice for being more efficient. And as I choose this engine for my business, I had to stick with this for my performance options. and it was actually a pretty good base.
Okay. Let's come back to that. You just mentioned your business. So this is Boxeer, I'm assuming you're talking about?
Right.
Okay. Can you give us a quick rundown on what Boxeer is and what services you provide?
Yes. So I offer engine transplants for the Volkswagen bus community. So mostly Volkswagen buses from the 80s to 80 to 92. All those water-cooled engines or gasoline, and they are rear-engine vehicles. So I created this conversion kit that replaces the original vehicle engine, and essentially it turns the power up. Mileage is double the mileage, and so that is what I do for the business Boxeer.
Okay, so that's a fairly niche market, and we're talking here for those who aren't maybe familiar with that particular vehicle. It's not this isn't a performance vehicle, is it? We're talking about sort of an overlander type vehicle, and I know you've had your own fairly extensive experience traveling around in one of these. So how on earth do you decide, hey, you know what, I'm going to build an engine conversion for this fairly niche vehicle?
So when I moved from France to the USA in 2010, I didn't know the Volkswagen bus were here in the US. I mean, those models, they are the Vanagons, and I was very shocked to see them. So I met a guy actually on a parking lot on a grocery store. He has this beautiful Vanagon, and I leaned down and see this Subaru engine. So I was amazed by seeing an old vehicle with a newer engine. This is the things that you don't see in France. So I started to chat with the guy, and turns out there's a huge community of swap in the US. And that's where I put the relationship, because I did a swap in France, but it was a diesel swap. So it was like, it's not a huge swap. It's just the same block in France. It's the same block, but updated turbos and everything. But here in America, it's a whole different engine. So I was like, oh, there's a big opportunity here to put whatever engine in the van. And I did a search, and really, coming from France, where we have 80% of the vehicles diesel, I was surprised in the USA there was none of those diesel swaps, really. A few guys did TDis, but not very well done, kind of homemade, not super pro.
Okay, so basically the solution to improve the power and efficiency of that particular vehicle, better mileage, etc., not strictly with the aim of improving performance, but that's as an aside. Is that sort of a reasonable summary of why you're providing this solution?
Right.
Okay.
And availability. It was just a very abundant engine in the USA, so it was perfect too.
Let's jump back a little bit. As you mentioned, you and probably most people getting the idea from your accent, you're originally born and bred in France before moving to the US. What's your sort of background in terms of your training? How did you get into building and modifying engines?
I got out of school. I was 14, and I started to do technical school. So from 14 to 21, I was doing internships on and off. So in France, there are those programs where you go 2 weeks in technical school and 2 weeks in your working place. I wanted to do mechanic back then, but they said there were only room for body work, available spot for this. So I decided to go for it. And body work ended up being a passion, where I had no idea what it was first. But I really got connected to working the metal, like welding. I learned how to weld, how to expand metal, retract metal, make shapes from blank piece of metal, sheet metal.
Okay. So this is a little beyond just, how would we put it, panel beating, repair work. This is actually making bodywork from scratch, just from a flat sheet of metal. Is that what I'm getting from you?
Yes. So in France, there is those restoration because those old vehicles, let's say the horses are pulling I don't know how you call this. So these need restoration, like those pieces that doesn't even exist. And so we made those, In France, there is schools that maintain those crafting. So I did that. It was interesting.
I'm guessing those skills are really just about extinct these days. Would that be fair to say? Not a lot of people really passing on that knowledge like they used to?
I would say that my teachers were in the 60s, like very close to the retirement. And I believe those were the last one from this generation of old stuff. And the new teacher was a new generation of kids, probably had like the more modern plastic fenders, how to unclip the plastic clips without damaging them, and I don't know what not.
How to order a new part from the manufacturer when it's dented, basically.
Right.
All right, let's talk about how you move from bodywork into engine performance, though, because those really are two worlds apart and not a lot of sort of cross-pollination between the two. So, yeah, how did that all go down?
So, actually, it's funny, but in order for me to go to this technical school, I was using a moped. And when I had to get a moped to go to school, I grabbed one that was like completely modified, had big carbs, ignition system, pipes. And so I had to learn to maintain this thing running. And it was a very huge learning curve. So I did a lot of two-stroke performance engine right at 14. We had a big bore kit. We had to tinker with ignition timing. So we seized a lot of cylinders. We bent a lot of crank. So I guess it started there more than anything. And I was lucky enough to know some important people in the south of France that were doing racing, like Paulini brand. One of the Paulini Montiore distributor was 30 minutes from my house, and we had a relationship. So I saw the guy like tuning those two-stroke on a dyno. I was like, whoa, there's a dyno for these things. And from the very early age, just see that performance was possible to achieve, and there was a way to do it properly.
Okay, so how did that sort of transition into some formal qualifications? What were you taught around engines from a trade school versus what you actually learned yourself? No, I'll clarify that question a little bit. One of the sort of areas with performance engine building that differs from the likes of maybe just reconditioning a everyday road car engine is the sort of the components that we're going to be using, the clearances and tolerances that we work to, etc. This subtle but really important differences. So what I'm getting at with this is a lot of people who maybe have gone through a formal qualification in a trade school to learn how to recondition engines, they may do a great job at rebuilding factory engines, but that doesn't necessarily translate across to being able to take a stock engine that produced, let's say, 200 horsepower and modify that to the point where it's making 400 or 500 horsepower reliably at a significantly higher RPM range. So I'm interested to know how you developed that specific skill set.
I think it started with Spike's Peak. So in 2013, I built this Subaru diesel that was a 2-liter, a 4-cylinder Boxeer diesel, like super rare, super new engine. And I had no notion of diesel engine tuning back then. I was diving into it. And I ran into this guy, Andrew Stauffer, which is a super well-known guy in the diesel world. He owns SNS Diesel in Indiana, which is the most important diesel tuning and preparation place in the USA. I ran into him, and he was tuning those engines, the 2-liter, for a program. It was a military program. And so I was providing the engine, and so we crossed path. And that's all how it started.
Let's just come back one step. So you decided to compete at Pikes Peak, and you decided out of all of the engines that are available, the Boxeer diesel Subaru was your pick. What made you choose that engine?
So I was using this in my vans. That's a
right. So it's just a carryover from the van.
Yeah.
So because those vans you were doing Subaru and the Volkswagen Audi Tdi engines, is that correct?
Right. I started with the Subaru diesel back in the days.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify that, because that seems, without a little bit more background information, like maybe a bit of an obscure pick. So I just wanted to clear that up.
Right.
All right. So this Subaru 2-litre Boxeer diesel engine, stock form, what sort of power are we talking?
Factory would make 150 horse.
And what did you end up doing to it, and where did it sort of end up power-wise?
Well, so that was the sad thing about this engine. That's why we stopped. We could only get 175 out of this thing. Any drop of extra diesel in there or extra boost will crack the cylinder. The cylinder were completely floating, so not exactly a closed deck. There were a few modifications to do to get to 200 horse, but it wasn't worth it at the end of the day. So actually, we had 175 horse, but at Pikes Peak, we dynoed it, and it was barely making 98 horsepower. So it was in 2013. That was my first diving into the tuning experience.
So I assume that the low power output at Pikes Peak is simply a result of the altitude and the low barometric air pressure?
Exactly. It was shocking.
So I can only imagine that would have been a maybe somewhat boring drive up the hill.
So it was raining and hailing.
Okay, that'll make it more interesting.
Right. So I had quite a run. It was actually properly a safe power to have for the hail and the rain, and being a rookie. So I quite enjoyed the drive. We did in 14 minutes and some. It was okay. A lot of people didn't finish it. A lot of people didn't make it that far and didn't make it to the top. So we were pretty pumped to do that run.
I've been to Pikes Peak. I've been lucky enough to be to Pikes Peak supporting a car a couple of years in a row, and I can attest to the weather there being very brutal and very changeable. And the number of cars with hail damage from hail the size of golf balls, it's quite an eye opener. So there's no discredit in getting a car to the finish line in the sort of weather I've seen there. So what you're saying there as well with that Subaru engine, it's obviously every engine from the manufacturer is designed around a particular power level, and obviously they're going to be safe and reliable at that stock power level. Most often we see, let's say the block, for example, will have quite a high sort of over-engineered safety factor. So when we want to maybe increase the power level by 20, 30, 50% even, typically the block's going to be up to that. So this is quite unique in that basically what you're saying is that Subaru block, without significant modifications and a lot of money obviously being thrown at it, the block is almost at its limit even in stock form at 150 horsepower. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So from there with the Subaru, did you decide to essentially shelve that project and move on to a different engine with a little bit more potential?
Yeah, so it was very unlucky, but they decided to, unlucky and lucky at the same time. They decided to stop producing this engine in 2015. The Japanese were done with this engine. So I had to change to an available engine for my business, because I make those kits, every week I have to send a kit to a customer. And so I swapped to the TDi, and that was a whole different story. Like the TDi is like a Cummins engine. It's like a cast block that can take all the power you throw at it. And this made a whole new potential for performance.
Now talk to us about the TDi engine in terms of stock form. We're talking 2-litre 4-cylinder. What sort of power level do they produce in the factory format?
They like to be around 200 horsepower from factory. They push it in Europe in a particular nice sedan to 240 horsepower out of the 2-liter, which is huge.
Okay.
It's the most powerful 2-liter diesel engine production.
So what are the limiting factors in that engine in stock form, and when you're starting to modify one for race use, what needs to be changed?
The first thing is the pistons to accept the cylinder pressure. The stock will start to melt when a modified one would hold the pressure required. Second, I'd say the rods and bearings.
Okay, so just not strong enough to withstand the cylinder pressure, and then, as you mentioned, the pistons can't withstand the temperature that they're being subjected to as well.
Right. It's a balance, right? From the exhaust temperature or cylinder pressure, you got to choose, and put too much timing, send it to cylinder pressure, and not enough into the exhaust. So EGTs will be saving, the cylinder pressure a little bit.
All right, we'll come and talk about some of the tuning aspects in a second. In terms of aftermarket parts for these TDI engines, is this well supported by mainstream manufacturers, or did you have to go and have components made?
So at first, I had a model of an engine that was pretty well supported. You could get rods made and pistons, injectors, valves, cams, everything you wanted. But those engines were getting outdated. So the best common rail technology available was the 2017 out of the Tiguan or TDi, 240 horse stock. And this engine actually had, from factory, ported heads, huge valves, huge cams with more lift than any other TDI aftermarket, remelted pistons, treatment, big rods. Everything was much stronger from factory than the aftermarket. So even the studs out of this 2017 were the ARP studs, which was incredible.
All in factory format.
Yeah, like yeah. So I decided to go with this engine because I had the built engine, the cams, everything, but everything was just not perfect. Where that one came from the factory, absolutely dialed in. So I started with that.
So 240 horsepower stock, what's the sort of power limitation that you found with reliability on that Tiguan engine?
So the tuners that do the stage things, stage 1, stage 2, they were making 305 horse from factory, which is pretty huge for 2-liter TDI. And I took that engine and pushed it to, we do 440 horse, which is
still with exactly factory trim.
Few mods, but
okay.
Like the injectors and the full standalone
Sorry, yeah,
system.
I'm talking more about the engine long block itself is still the factory componentry.
Yes. 110 horsepower per cylinder.
That's exceptional. One of the aspects with diesel engines compared to gas engines is, typically the operating RPM range is significantly lower. It's not unusual for a diesel engine to have a factory rev limit of maybe 4,500 RPM or thereabouts, and obviously with a conventional gas engine, we're more used to seeing rev limits in the region of sort of 7,500, maybe 8,000 RPM. And when we look at that equation for horsepower, it's obviously we take our torque, multiply that by our RPM, and then divide it by a constant. So the RPM becomes a really powerful multiplier, and when we want to make a lot of horsepower, really what we want to do is make torque, which is essentially just airflow at high RPM. Now, long-winded way of just talking about the physics behind this, but there's problems, of course, with diesel engines. When we want to rev them higher, they're built with a lot more rigidity and strength in the components to withstand the cylinder pressures, hence all of the components are heavier, so they don't really like to rev. So, long question there, Greg, but what I'm trying to get to is, are you extending that factory rev limit beyond what the stock rev limit is, or are you just working within that normal rev range?
We increased it quite significantly. We went to 6,200 RPM, which is very very high for TDI.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, one of the problems that comes with that, and this really comes down to the componentry, we quite often get asked this around gasoline engines. Can I extend my rev limit by 1,000 RPM? And the answer quite often is, well, maybe you can. But the more important aspect of that is, with no other modifications, just simply revving the engine 1,000 RPM further is not necessarily going to actually result in any more power. If we look at the factory power and torque curve, the torque will be dropping away at the factory rev limit significantly. Maybe we've got our peak torque value at 2,500 RPM with a diesel engine, and then it's falling away after that. So our power will continue to climb. Maybe that peaks 3.5, maybe 4,000 RPM and then falls away. So if we take that and rev it to 6, we're well on the backside of that curve. So typically getting performance at higher RPM requires some modifications in terms of maybe a set of cams or a cam grind that is more sort of focused on high RPM airflow. Maybe it's going to require some head porting and modifications as well to allow the head to flow. And then obviously the rotating assembly requires the strength to actually spin to that RPM. You mentioned, though, you're still in stock form with the engine internal. So am I right in saying you actually hadn't changed the cam profile or head porting or anything like that?
Not yet.
Okay, and it just works.
It's mind-blowing.
Is it safe to assume that some of this does come from external modifications, though, in terms of turbo sizing?
Before this, I would say, so I have this combustion analyzer. It's a full engine combustion analyzer. So it records the pressure in the cylinders in real time. This was the key to, along with some advices from, I have a good friend, Chad, senior calibration engineer from a massive engine manufacturer in the US. So we could analyze the data and see where we could keep pushing. I mean, the turbo is important, yes, but having this data, such as cylinder pressure, was very important.
Let's talk about that cylinder pressure data. This is something that not a lot of tuners get access to because it is still a very expensive technology, albeit it has come down a lot over the last decade or so. It also requires a little bit of work to actually fit the required sensors into the engine, but I can only imagine, not having worked with one myself, that we can learn a lot about the engine and the tune from that data. So first of all, can you talk to us about the sensors themselves and how you went about fitting those into the combustion chamber? Obviously, it's a fairly nasty place to be putting any kind of sensor, and there's also some limitations typically around how and where we can fit them. I know in gasoline engines we can use what they call instrumented spark plugs, where the sensor is actually installed into a special spark plug to get easy access. What's the sort of solution in the diesel world?
So it's very easy. We get rid of the glow plugs, and we have this beautiful port.
It's almost made for it.
Yes, that actually companies such as Uptrend make diesel sensors that are shaped based off the glow plug sensors. So it's like an M10 by 1, same length, and you screw that thing in there. You don't have to make anything really special. It's expensive, but it's easy for a diesel.
Yeah, I absolutely just didn't even consider the glow plug. So yeah, you've got some big advantages versus trying to fit them into a gas engine. So that makes things much easier. So essentially, again, for those who maybe aren't sort of familiar with this technology, it's a sensor that goes, as we've mentioned there, into the combustion chamber. So it's literally just monitoring at very high frequency the pressure through the full engine cycle, and that's mapped versus the crankshaft position essentially in the analysis software. So what are you using that data for, and how what is it actually telling you?
So in the motorsports world and the diesel industry, they like to keep a cylinder pressure number. Let's say in the Dakar, I have good relationship with the Peugeot team. we get some numbers about what's a good cylinder pressure for sustained. So we compare from, like, the factory engine can take 200 bars. This Tiguan or TDI. It's built for 200 bars. And the racing industry standard for sustained will say 280 is a nice number. So we use of course it's experimental, but we use those initial numbers to start our experiments. So we target a cylinder pressure number, and we see how we can play with timing to please the EGT and maintain the cylinder pressure. And eventually you end up with this beautiful balance. You can keep increasing your cylinder pressure and see how long it lasts. You will not know. Let's say I set it to 350 bars and I can do 50 laps. It's going to work, but I have to open it to see if the pistons got damage, or I need to analyze. So what we did was we had a given number that was a little high, but we want to push the engine. And we had so many cycles, open the engine, and we knew as a baseline that so many bars at this cylinder pressure, that EGT, that timing is perfect. Like, the engine was still brand new after 100 hours of abuse.
You've mentioned a few elements there that come into the tuning. So let's dive into that a little bit. And I think before we do, we probably just need to have a real basic sort of high-level understanding of diesel engine operation. And yeah, I think, having gone through this myself, spending my whole life basically tuning gasoline engines, when you transition across to diesel tuning, basically almost everything you've learned goes out the window, and you have to unlearn that and understand the operation of the diesel. And I mean, obviously, the predominant thing here is that we're dealing with a compression ignition engine. There is no spark plug, so we don't have ignition timing or spark timing like we do in a gas engine, but instead, in a very similar way, what we've got is injection timing. And we've got a very high compression ratio typically in the diesel engine that's designed to create heat in the combustion chamber. And then with a common rail diesel engine, we inject the fuel relatively close to TDC, where there's a huge amount of heat being produced by that compressed air. There's a bit of a delay, and then the fuel and air will mix and start to combust just due to the heat. So that's the compression ignition element. So we've got, instead of spark timing, we've got injection timing, so which in essence does define where the burn is going to begin. We've also got fuel pressure, which is very critical, and then we've got the fuel quantity or fuel mass, which has a big driver on power. So I mean, again, from a gas engine perspective, really what makes the power is how much air we can cram into the engine, and we really have to keep our air-fuel ratio across a relatively narrow range to keep the engine happy and make good power. With the diesel engine, it works really almost the opposite way. We're actually controlling the power with the amount of fuel we're injecting, which is why typically we don't have a throttle body in the diesel engine. It'll quite happily combust exceptionally lean air-fuel ratios with no problem. So we're always operating, or predominantly operating, with a diesel engine on the lean side of stoic. And as we add more fuel, we make more power. But of course, there is a limit to this, because as we add fuel, we end up with more combustion chamber temperature as well. And that puts more heat into the parts, which you've alluded to. Now, we don't typically get the opportunity, though, unfortunately, to measure directly what's happening inside the cylinder. So in the diesel tuning world, the exhaust gas temperature, or EGT sensor, has kind of been the gold standard in sort of monitoring the quality of our tune-up. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you use that EGT sensor and what it's telling you?
So the EGT sensor is basically giving me a number that ensure I'm not damaging the turbo componentry. Like, let's say the EFR turbo is capable of 950C. After that, you might start to melt some stuff. So we draw a line there. We don't want to go over that. So The EGT, essentially, we're trying to keep it as low as possible. Of course, we try to increase our cooling capacity at the intercooler side. But the EGT, we like it when we max it out, but not over. So for us, we're 950. It's almost a melting point. And how do I use it? We can play with the timing, of course. If we get too close to cylinder pressure limit, we balance on the EGT. If we exceed the EGT limit, we have to send back to cylinder pressure. If we exceed the cylinder pressure, we have to reduce fuel. It's just a closed loop, essentially.
So EGT, cylinder pressure, and then you're adjusting your tuning parameters around maintaining or not exceeding your preferred limits for both of those parameters.
Right. And timing. So we try to optimize EGT and cylinder pressure and timing together. And if we exceed, we have to lower fuel. That's a rule. You have to keep the limits, happy.
Now you've mentioned there the sort of temperature limit of the turbine wheel, turbine housing, 950 degrees C, which 1750 F, if my math is about right. That's only one element, though. We've also got the internal components of the engine to consider, and at very high EGTs, again, we're measuring exhaust gas temperature, which has a correlation to the combustion temperature, which is what the piston and the cylinder head are being exposed to. 1750 degrees Fahrenheit sounds exceptionally high to me for a diesel engine in terms of keeping those internal parts internal and intact. Is that not an issue? You're quite happy running sort of 1750 Fahrenheit and not worrying about your internal componentry?
So these are worries that people have when they don't have the cylinder pressure data. But the heat generated by the cylinder pressure is exhausted. Essentially, the cylinder pressure is a relationship of the heat. So when we have a 280 bar, let's say, cylinder pressure limit, this translates into a heat number that is a combustion chamber heat number. We're not exceeding that, which is what the valves can sustain. As soon as it exits the valve, it's all turbo. It's all about your hardware limits. For us, we know that we're not exceeding the cylinder pressure that is possible to operate for 100 hours. We're happy with that number. And we also know that we don't exceed the limit on the hardware turbos. So I see what you mean for the internal temperatures, but for diesel engine with controlled cylinder pressure, we know exactly where we're at, and that's how we do it in the diesel world.
One of the inputs that we rely on heavily in the gasoline tuning world is air-fuel ratio, and much less so on exhaust gas temperature, to the point that EGT outside of high-level drag racing is probably not very common on gas engines. Air-fuel ratio, we've got that on every engine we tune. With diesel, there's also a relationship between the combustion pressure, obviously, exhaust gas temperature, and the air-fuel ratio. So are you utilising air-fuel ratio at all in your tuning, or not necessary given the other inputs, including combustion pressure, that you are focusing on so heavily?
So we do have a wideband lambda, and we use it. So we talk in richness. So we like to stay around like 900. It's just a number that we like. It has a little black smoke, but just a very slight one. And it's usually clean. Like if we could keep it at 850 richness, we would be crystal clear. We like to add a little bit to, just because we don't want to be too lean. Then we would just throw power out of the window. Instead, we want to add a touch extra.
So those numbers that you just mentioned there, 900 and 850s, so how are those relating to lambda on the lambda scale? I'm not quite sure I follow there.
So I'm using this French ECU, and it's richness unit. It's 1 over lambda. So essentially,
equivalence ratio?
1/lambda. So it's just a little reversed, but once you set on a number, you stick to it. But essentially, I would say it's equivalent to an AFR that the tuner likes to have on their gasoline.
Okay,
like a 14.
And we are talking. I mentioned there earlier when we were just talking about the basics of diesel tuning. The different part is that we're operating on the lean side of stoic. When we're tuning a gasoline engine, if we've got high exhaust gas temperature, high combustion temperature, we can cool that combustion temperature by adding fuel. But it's sort of because we're on the lean side of stoic with the diesel engines, it's actually the opposite. If we add fuel, we actually add temperature, correct?
Yes and no. Also, you can add more fuel in a shorter amount of time and reduce temperature.
Sure, okay. Just talking about how you're actually getting that fuel, where you're getting that fuel into the combustion chamber.
Right.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the ECU that you're using. You just mentioned you've got a French ECU in there. The diesel tuning world is a little unique in that there's not too many options available for aftermarket standalones. A lot of the tuning is done with reflashing. Am I right in assuming that this unit that you're referring to is a standalone?
Yep. Standalone ECU. Reach out to them, and turned out they equip all the best European Dakar rigs, like all the best Baja diesel racing happening in Portugal and in Spain, in France, is equipped with that ECU. So I was like, oh, okay, it's legit. They have no social media. Like the website is like 50 years old, and I cannot believe that. But we're about to help them a little bit.
What's the brand?
So it's called Skynam.
Okay, I think we'll put that in the show notes.
Actually, Skynam is the diesel name, but the actual name is a Sybel. Sybel, Sybele.
So what was involved with getting your engine up and running on that particular ECU? Were they able to support you, or you have to kind of figure all that out for yourself?
Well, so that helped that I was French. I got in touch with the owner of the company, and he helped me set it up, the basics. So, sync, crank, and cam. That's the most complicated to get into the standalone. If you left by yourself and try to figure this one, it's hard. So he helped me with this. Then set up the basic sensors. You have to set up like coolant temperature sensor, the rail pressure sensor, the fuel temperature sensor. So the very basic ones, right? I started in 2010 with him. So that was very long journey to get to where we are today at 110 per cylinder. So yeah, he set me up the basics, and we got the engine running. And then, you break engines and melt pistons and learn the hard limits. And we trashed so many engines. We probably have a dozen of blocks around the shop just because of the standalone.
Is this prior to the opportunity to have access to that in-cylinder pressure monitoring data, that you were having issues with braking engines?
Yeah. I learned the hard way. So I did it mostly by myself, the tuning, and just like the mopeds, seize, replace. And so I guess I just recently had this combustion analyzer, but that's like, I almost didn't need it. I was wanting it because I got good at it and wanted more control about the fine stuff. And it does help. We can shave like more power out of the engine.
Okay. Let's talk about Pikes Peak and specifically the car that you have been running up to this point, your Beetle with this TDI engine in it, which is a fairly, unfortunately we don't have the benefit of being able to show some pictures, but we could probably link some in the show notes so our listeners can get a sense of what we're talking about here. So it's a fairly unique combination there. You've got a Volkswagen Beetle with this TDI engine in the back, and also, from what I understand, a Porsche PDK 7-speed dual clutch transmission, essentially. Is that about correct?
Yep.
How did that combination come about for a start? Why did you start with the base of the Volkswagen Beetle?
So to represent my camper company, I really wanted an iconic vehicle. And I noticed in Europe, they ran this Volkswagen Bug as a cup. It's called the Fun Cup. Essentially it's a race car tube chassis with a shape of a bug on it. Fairly light, mid-engine, which was a key for success. And so I pulled the trigger on one. I found the Fun Cup USA. So in 2008, they attempted to bring the Fun Cup in California, and they had two original cars. And so I saw it and so the ad was a picture of the Fun Cup that was took by the editor, and the editor posted it on Facebook before the book was published. It was back in the days where the ads were on the books, you know. So I looked on Facebook, Fun Cup for sale, Fun Cup, like for 6 months, and I see this photo. Contact the guy. I'm like, yep. How did you know? Like, what? I see the phone number on the photo. Call him. Go straight to Colorado next day. Grab the Fun Cup. The book was not even published. I bought it. But so this to me was a key to have this mid-engine. Just because all the successful cars are mid-engine, like, you know, all the prototypes are mid-engine, all the Dakar that race and win are mid-engine, the best Peugeot T16 is mid-engine. So I was like, that's it.
I can't argue with the mid-engine aspect. You're 100% correct there, and it makes a lot of sense. And again, for those who have maybe Googled the Fun Cup and have a sense of what we're talking about, one obvious downside is it looks like it has the aerodynamics of a brick. Am I right?
Yeah, it's pretty terrible. Like the stock Fun Cup, they use 140 horsepower engines. Race it for 25 hours. I think it's fun there. And I pushed it. I pushed it to Pikes Peak 2020. All the videos in the link, they will probably represent my car when it was 280 horse, the compound at Pikes Peak. And yeah, the aero was not very good. It's a good car though. It was great. I can't complain about that choice I made. It brought me to where I am today. I'm super happy I dived into that project.
Am I right in saying that you were runner-up in the diesel record at Pikes Peak back in, is it 2020, to Old Smoky, the truck? Is that correct?
So yeah. So during that run, I lost my brakes for 1 minute and 45 seconds.
Wow.
So I have it in the data. The Plex combustion analyzer has brake pressure. It has everything. And so during my run, I did a mistake where the brake fluid was been flushed, and we put some like terrible brake fluid in there. It wasn't like the 600. It was like some crap. And that hurted me on the 2020 run, because I was in a 10-minute club on the qualification runs. But on race day, the heat added. Like, it's the only time where you can see the heat add up. And man, Pikes Peak has so much stress on the brakes that you don't even duplicate that heat stress at the track.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of unique aspects with Pikes Peak. Obviously, the altitude is one thing, and most people sort of can get their head around the fact that at high altitude and low barometric pressure, your engine's going to make less power. That's pretty easy to understand. But the part that I think a lot of people overlook as well is that the lower air density actually also affects the cooling properties of everything on the car as well. The oil, the coolant, and obviously airflow onto the brakes. There's less cooling happening there. So that's, you know, one problem. The next is that the way Pikes Peak runs as an event, you've got the week of practice leading up to the event, but they split the hill into 3 sections. So you practice on one section a day, and you never actually get to do the full run from top to bottom or bottom to top until race day. So the difference in running over a section that might be a few minutes long versus a full run that might be 9 to 11 minutes, that's a big difference on components like the brakes, correct?
Yep, that's right.
Now, the interesting aspect, well, there's two interesting aspects here other than the fact that it is running a diesel engine. First of all, let's talk about the compound turbo aspect, because this isn't something we see too often, and where we do see it is usually in applications where we're trying to run very, very high boost pressures, and we're basically outside of the efficiency of a single compressor. So we can sort of compound the turbos and basically get a multiplication effect for the boost pressure, keep both of the turbos operating within the efficiency of their compressor maps. What was the impetus behind compounding for you? Because it doesn't sound like you're really stretching the boost limits or boost capability of the turbo.
That's true. We keep it pretty chill right now, but we're about to crank it up. So we kept blowing turbos in 2019 and 2018, single turbos, and we didn't know. It was a learning curve that if you put 2.5 bars of pressure at your turbo at sea level, it's fine. But you put 2.5 bars at Pikes Peak and your turbo has to spin an extra 100,000 RPM to create that pressure. And that's where you learn that the turbo has a hard limit on the RPM. That's where we added turbo speed sensors on all the turbos.
And that's one of the nice aspects with some of these newer performance-based turbos from the likes of BorgWarner with their EFR series and Garrett. We do have, first of all, the ease of being able to fit a turbo speed sensor, which traditionally used to be a bit of a ball ache and require some pretty intricate machining. Now there's just a nice little hole through the compressor cover, and if you want to use it, you drill it out, add the sensor, job done. So that gives us an indication of where we are in the turbo speed, and the manufacturers then give us a hard limit so we can make sure we stay under that. Generally, if we do, all things being equal, the turbo's probably going to lead a fairly long and healthy life. The bit that, again, it's sort of this Pikes Peak aspect, and it's not just Pikes Peak, it's altitude, but Pikes Peak sort of is the most extreme of those events. And what's easy to overlook is it's not just the boost pressure that the turbo cares about, it's actually the pressure ratio. So that's the pressure at the compressor outlet divided by the pressure at the compressor inlet. And that inlet pressure, generally give or take, is going to be barometric air pressure. So what I'm getting at here is, as we go from sea level to the start line of Pikes Peak, which I think was maybe around 9,000 feet, up to the summit, 14,000 feet, the barometric air pressure at the compressor inlet is continually dropping. So if we want to make the same boost pressure in the inlet manifold that we were seeing at sea level, we're basically working that turbo harder and harder at a continually higher pressure ratio. And that also has an impact of where, not just our turbo speed, but where we're working on that compressor map as well. So is that another aspect where this compounding comes into it? Just again, trying to keep turbo speed down and make sure we're in the efficiency of the compressor map at very high altitude?
Of course, yeah. This is when you get deep into the turbocharging, the ratio is super important. So we keep optimal location on the ratio mapping. And we actually have a tuning that involves turbo speed limit, and we wastegate based on RPM, based on altitude. So we change the RPM limit of the turbo based on altitude, and we manage the wastegate based on turbo speed sensor. So we always keep the optimal speed at the turbo. And since we have 3 turbo, we can, as we wastegate open, transfer the heat energy to the next turbo, keeping all the turbo always happy within their optimal speed and pressure ratio, because it's eventually with the PDK we use a small range of RPM. We focus 6,200 RPM is like the extreme in the last gear when we do top speed only. But we focus on 4,800 RPM to 5,600 RPM. This is our power band. When you have this narrowed down to the narrow band, we can just see what the turbo likes to rev at for this particular power band. And so it ended up being pretty easy to keep everything happy and performing super well at the best pressure ratio, because our power band is almost like 1,000 RPM only, or maybe 1,500 RPM max. Yeah. Versus a gasoline engine would have to be happy from 3,000 to 10,000, or I don't know, whatever they like to shift at.
In terms of the boost pressure at the inlet manifold, so forgetting about pressure ratio for a moment, you've mentioned there about turbo speed monitoring and changing that target versus altitude. So what's that actually doing in terms of your boost pressure in the inlet manifold? Are you trying to maintain that fairly consistent from the start line to the finish line, or are you dropping it away in order to keep under the turbo speed limit as the altitude climbs? What I guess really the question there is, are you trying to maintain a relatively consistent power level from the engine the whole way up the hill climb, or do you get to a situation where you inevitably just have to let the power drop off a little bit at higher altitude?
We decided to keep focusing on the hard limits, such as EGT, cylinder pressure, and intake pressure. We keep this a variable. It varies a little from start line to finish line. The physics do change the numbers a lot, but the performance is the same. We find the engine to perform extremely well from start to finish line. We don't have any losses. Our focus is on EGT and cylinder pressure. The intake can change some. That obviously affects the cylinder pressure, but in a good way. As we go up, temperature increases, and at the end of the run, you end up with a big temperature mass in the whole engine bay. Everything is really hot, and that's where you could take advantage of a tiny bit less power. So everything works out to be perfect. It's very, very amazing.
Let's talk about the Pdk transmission, because it sounds like it is really one of the key elements of making this package work, given you've already talked about the relatively narrow rev range that you're using, and this is a 7-speed transmission as well, so hence tighter ratios than if you had less gears. So that all works in your favour. The problem, as I see it, though, is a modern dual clutch transmission, regardless whether it's DSG, PDK, or whatever it may be, there's some fairly complex two-way communications between the engine control module and the transmission control module for everything to work. So how are you kind of communicating with that? Are you still using the Porsche transmission control module, or is it all aftermarket?
So we use this aftermarket controller. It's from Poland, the GCU. So we communicate with CAN bus. So essentially, we have a small amount of data that go through this. We keep it as simple as possible. We have RPM, TPS, so I guess pedal position sensor, and torque. We have a compensation that's torque based, but we don't even use that anymore.
Okay, so I mean, in a stock format, the dual clutch transmission, simplified, basically, when you request an upshift and you're at full throttle, basically in most cases the gearbox controller will request a torque reduction from the engine control module so that it can complete the shift without potentially damaging the clutches. Once the clutch is engaged in the next gear, then the gearbox controller will say to the engine control module, all right, we can go back to full torque again. And that's kind of how that progresses. We're on the other side of things. when it downshifts, obviously we need to rev match, and there's that same sort of requests there. Have you got that same two-way communication and requests going on that I've just talked about with your aftermarket standalone option?
So we used to have this going. So my engine ECU would send torque and RPM, and also know when the gear would be happening, and we would have a torque reduction happen. But this actually didn't do any benefits, so we got rid of it. The beauty of having a 2-liter is that it's a very tiny engine with not much mass, and the PDK can take all the abuse from a 2-liter. It's still manageable.
So essentially, torque reduction on an upshift, not essential with the actual torque you're putting through the PDK.
Exactly.
On the flip side of that, though, if we don't rev match on a downshift and get that pretty nicely matched, that can cause some problems with the likes of compression locking under braking as you're shifting down through the gears. Is that just not an issue with the close ratio box? You're not attempting to rev match?
So this is like an issue with like the sequentials, but the PDK has so many gears that the gear change are happening so frequently that the difference in RPM is almost negligible. So when I downshift, the PDK is not getting a 5,000 RPM difference. It's getting 1,000 RPM difference or 1,500. So it's so minimal that it's not getting affected by those shift. It's just
so.
Super
In
smooth.
other words, you can essentially run the PDK almost completely independent of the engine, and there's no real need for any torque manipulation.
That's right. In my case, for my RPM usage for the TDI, it turns out to be a very good solution.
Interesting. All right, you've got a new build that's underway, and from what I understand, it's up and running, and it's going to be heading to Pikes Peak in June for the 100th running of the hill climb. This one, it sounds like it's basically taken what you've learned so far with the bug and sort of put it on steroids. Tell us what your platform is.
I decided to move to the Radical. It's a prototype chassis. It's also a mid-engine. I was able to transfer the whole package from the bug and integrate it into the Radical. It turns out to be almost 400 pounds lighter than the bug, a lot more aerodynamic, and a lot better center of gravity. The Radical is a British prototype cup that's very successful nowadays. I thought it would be a good chassis to get into, and it turns out it's amazing. I had my first laps. I was blown away by the new performance.
I mean, you don't have to really reinvent anything when you're using that Radical as a chassis, because, as you mentioned, it's a very well understood and well developed package from Radical in the UK at this point. So essentially it's just a case of bolting in an engine and PDK combination that you've already developed, and you basically should be in a situation where you can hit the ground running. Now, we know that the theory is one thing, but reality is often something slightly different, and there's always sort of unintended consequences or issues that pop up that are hard to predict when you're in the planning stages of a project. I mean, I understand this is still fairly early on, and as we're recording, we've still probably got a month or so to go before Pikes Peak actually runs. So you got some testing to do, no doubt. Is there anything that's cropped up so far that sort of you didn't expect that's going to need some attention? Except
the new open cab. I mean, I'm just like open cockpit. It's a different preparation, I would say. I have to plan for a helmet that has a visor down. Except the environment, like the car is surprisingly well dialed in, because we didn't change too much from the original design. Turns out those cars are designed for one driver and one passenger. And by moving to central seat and getting rid of all the stuff for those two people, we ended up with like very similar weight distribution. And so far, I'm not worried about anything catching the progress. So I mean, no, nothing.
Okay,
nothing bad.
Well, that's good.
Yeah,
that's ideal. The dream scenario. In terms of weight, you mentioned you're 400 pounds under the weight of the bug, and we've sort of been talking about power, and at this point you've been talking about a 110 horsepower per cylinder, 440 horsepower for a 4-cylinder engine. Is that sort of where you're going to cap the power level for the Radical, or are you pushing it further? And what was the final weight on the Radical?
The 440 horse was from last year. We opened that engine and found a brand new everything. So we're going to juice it up some. Yeah, so the Radical is already mind-blowing, like much faster in any way. So I like to do testing at the drag strip. It's weird, but coming from France, I did all the driving when I was 18, Peugeot 205 GTI in the back roads, like taking all those crazy turns, those crazy roads, like backcountry. This is where I grew up. This is how I went to school. We raced, we almost died, and we were crazy after this. So for me now, like the focus is not how to drive in those crazy twisted roads, is how do you drive fast in between two turns, which Pikes Peak is a lot of 8-mile run in between two turns is perfect. So the drag, when I go there, I can simulate what it is between two of those Pikes Peak turns. It was like that was just perfect straight. They are 1/8 of a mile exactly. And so I go there and do all the testing, and this is where I get the good data.
So give us, you've said you're going to pump the power level up a little bit. Have you got an idea in mind of where that's going to end up?
We're shooting for just 5%. So we're going to crank up the fuel amount. It will affect the cylinder pressure, but it's taking it. We're going to touch the timing to keep the 5% increase in power directed in the cylinder, not in the EGTs. EGTs were capped. So this is
does that require you to advance the injection timing
exactly,
so that the combustion event's happening earlier in the cycle?
That's the beauty of this, is we just move the power where we want, because you can choose now with the cylinder pressure sensor. We're going to send 5% more in the head, and it's brand new now after so much abuse, so it will take it. There's no doubt.
You've had a bit of experience at Pikes Peak already, and you've got a combination that should be lighter, more powerful, better balanced, and much more aerodynamic. Are we allowed some predictions on where you see your final time coming in, and is that diesel world record within reach?
So in 2020, I was a second away from the record.
And that was with your brake problems?
Yeah. So they did 11:24. I was 11:25 with a minute and a half of no brakes. In 2021, I went there with good brakes, and I did a calculated 10:09, which was more representative of my performance. And that was with a bug and with brakes. And so now I have all the Radical package. It's much faster, just better experience about the track. Also, I've been racing this thing so much that now I know the track by heart, almost. I mean, as much as I can. There's still little turns that I need to work on, but I think this is what the testing is for.
So no actual number prediction? I mean, I'm guessing from what you've said there, it should be well into the 9s.
9-minute club, that's what we hope for. Okay. 9-minute club is pretty respectable, especially for a TDI engine.
100%. I think getting sub 10 minutes is respectable, irrespective of what you've got powering the vehicle. So that's going to be a huge accomplishment. Look, Greg, I think we'll move towards wrapping this thing up, and we've got 3 questions at the end we like to ask all of our guests. And the first of those is, what's next in the future for you and Boxeer? I mean, obviously we've just talked about in the very near future you've got Pikes Peak 2022, but beyond that, sort of, where do you see life headed for you?
Well, motorsports related, we have this second radical chassis with a new transmission. So we're going with a Lamborghini Huracan Audi R8 Quattro. So it's a mid-engine dual clutch, but instead of being a rear-wheel drive only, going four-wheel drive. And that's going to be key for Pikes Peak in the future to get this amazing traction out of the hairpins. Because right now we have a boost per gear and power per gear to traction control, because the first, second, and third are struggling to stay on track because of being a huge grade, being called the track.
So four-wheel drive is going to be a big benefit in the future.
Right.
All right. Given your career and everything you've sort of done so far, from bodywork to overland and Pikes Peak adventures, building and modifying and tuning these turbo diesel engines, is there any advice that you could give to maybe the 16-year-old version of yourself to maybe fast track your career and maybe avoid some of the pitfalls you've seen?
Wow. So it's tricky there, because if I had to give an advice, it would be to probably go look for a good tuner, a reputable tuner that can help you, but that also requires a ton of money when you're young. So the learning the hard way path was fun. It was pretty costly, probably more than a tuner, but I learned also deeper by doing the mistakes myself. So I don't know. I don't really know.
Wouldn't change a thing.
Yeah, I like to learn the hard way. I don't know. It brings you somewhere else than the regular path.
I do think that while it can be an expensive learning curve, sometimes, I mean, mistakes or finding limits, I should say, maybe more so than mistakes, is kind of natural when you're pushing the boundaries, and there should be no disrespect for that happening. Obviously, we need to learn from those mistakes so that they don't repeatedly happen. But yeah, that can teach you so much more than just having smooth plain sailing where nothing ever goes wrong. So I've experienced that, particularly with my drag racing, and much like you, I don't think I'd change anything. It broadened my own experience, and I learned more from the odd experience that went wrong than I probably did from those that just always went right. Our last question for today, Greg, if people want to follow you and see what you're up to, where can they do so? Have you got some social media options for them to follow along, your website, etc.?
We have the Instagram, Boxeer _ That's we post regularly about the progress, Pikes Peak, and all the overlanding stuff, turbo diesel, triple turbo pictures. YouTube, we try to keep up with that, and we have actually a videographer this year that makes a full documentary of the whole build. So we'll have a pretty epic video of chopping up the radical chassis, welding the new thing, and doing the testing, breaking stuff, keep going, and hopefully winning Pikes Peak diesel record. Facebook also has a page, the Boxeer.
Perfect. Well, we'll put some links to those locations in the show notes for people to be able to easily follow. It's been great to chat there, Greg. Great to get some insight into your experience so far. I'm definitely excited to see what you can do in that radical, and I know there is going to be a bit more competition in the diesel market at Pikes Peak. And so hopefully you got some competition to keep you honest. We'll see how things work out, but all the best for Pikes Peak this year, and we'll see where you come out, hopefully in that 9-minute club with a record.
Thank you so much, and I'll try to keep it on the track and put that 9-minute club time.
No problem. All right, we'll talk again soon. Cheers, Greg.
Cheers.
All right, that concludes our interview. And before we sign off, I just wanted to mention, for anyone who's been perhaps hiding under a rock and hasn't heard of High Performance Academy before, we are an online training school and we specialize in teaching a range of performance automotive topics, everything from engine tuning and engine building through to wiring, car suspension and wheel alignment, data analysis, and race driver education. Now, remember, you've got that coupon code. You can use podcast75 at the checkout to get $75 off the purchase of your first course. You'll find our full course list at hpacademy.com/courses. Important to mention that when you purchase a course from us, that course is yours for life as well. It never expires. You can rewatch the course as many times as you like, whenever you like. The purchase of a course will also give you 3 months of access to our Gold membership. That gives you access to our private members only forum, which is the perfect place to get answers to your specific questions. You'll also get access to our regular weekly members webinars, which is where we touch on a particular topic in the performance automotive realm. We dive into that topic for about an hour. If you can watch live, you can ask questions and get answers in real time. If the time zones don't work for you, that's fine too. You're going to get access as a Gold member to our previous webinar archive. We've got close to 300 hours of existing content in that archive. It is an absolute goldmine. So remember that coupon code podcast75. Check out our course list at hpacademy.com/courses.